Umut. Good morning and welcome to this COVID conversation. Just so everyone knows, Umut Erel. Umut is Professor of Sociology at the Open University, and for many years she's been working on issues of migration using participatory action research methods, and particularly arts-based methods. And today, as part of our feature on International Women's Day, we want to celebrate the wonderful work that Umut has done with migrant women over the years. And we're going to hear a little bit more about her research. So over to you, Umut. Can you tell us about the work that you did with women about no recourse to public funds and the theatre methods you used?
Yes, absolutely. It's great to be here, Mari, and yeah, good to be talking to you. So this is part of a project called the Participatory Arts and Social Action Research Project. And we undertook, let's say, 3 case studies or so. The project itself was quite open. We really wanted to explore how and whether these methods are useful for engaging with marginalized groups of migrant families. And I should mention that it was a collaborative project. So we were working as a research team. Myself, our research fellow, Irini Kaptani, who's also the theatre practitioner, because we use participatory theatre methods, and our colleague Maggie O'Neill, who's at University College Cork, and her long-standing expertise in walking methods, participatory walking methods, and our colleague Tracy Reynolds from Greenwich University. So that was the academic team, but we also teamed up with with a number of migrant support and arts organizations, and you'll find more information on our website and the films. But it's taking up a little bit of time to talk about this collaborative aspect and to mention our collaborators. But I think that's really important because working with different groups was one of the ways in which we were able to make sure that the research we undertook worked with, made their unique contribution. And I think without that collaboration, we would not have been able to achieve this, what we've been able to achieve. When we started out thinking about this project in 2015, this no recourse to public funds policy was something that was not that well known, not much discussed, let's say, outside of specialist migrant support organizations. At the time also, and that unfortunately is still the case, it wasn't really very well known exactly how many people are affected by this. So this policy stipulates, and it's been in existence for a long time, it stipulates that people don't have access, people who are migrants, and this group has been gradually extended over the last decade, and especially since 2012, when Theresa May began with the hostile environment policy. It's been gradually extended, and now it encapsulates everybody who is subject to migration control. So it means that if you encounter a crisis, any kind of problem where usually citizens, residents would then turn to the social services to ask for some support, let's say homelessness, let's say a family breakdown, let's say a health crisis, which has maybe made you unemployed. All of that means all of those crisis situations, usually people would turn to social services for some kind of support, either financial support or housing support, etc. However, for migrants, this is not possible, when oftentimes they're not fully aware of what that means, what that no recourse to public funds stipulation means, and they turn to their local authorities for support only to find out, no, you have no recourse to public funds, you're not eligible for any support. Actually, that's not quite true. So people who have children under the Children's Act are eligible for a form of very, very minimal support. And every local authority decides how much that should be. That could range from something, really minimal. We had participants who received something like £20 per week, perhaps, to something slightly more substantial. But it is certainly it's a bare minimum.
Okay.
And oftentimes the problem is that even though they are eligible for this type of minimal support, there's a lot of so-called gatekeeping happening, and local authorities don't really point people in the direction where they can get that support, or there's also misinformation going on, right? Both local authorities, and at the time when we started the research, also a lot of the migrant support organizations were confused, because it is very confusing legislation, and we're not really clear on how they were able to support families with recourse to public funds. That's sadly because this condition has become so pervasive. Also, migrant support organizations everywhere have become much more aware of this. And so let's say the reason that there's more awareness is not a positive reason, actually. I think it's simply because there's more and more people who are having to struggle with this.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about how COVID has exacerbated the problems of no recourse to public funds. But perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit more about the theatre methods you used and the wonderful film, which which we'll also show on our website. So perhaps you'd like to tell us more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we set out to explore how these methods can help with addressing a policy issue, a very concrete policy issue. Here, the no recourse to public funds policy. We wanted to find out if these methods can help the people who are actually affected by the policy to get into dialogue, to make social intervention into into this policy by talking to practitioners, by talking to policymakers. So usually this is quite difficult because this is a policy that really is pushing people into destitution, into poverty, sometimes homelessness. So really what happens is people are preoccupied with their day-to-day survival. And also there's, of course, a very sharp hierarchy of power between policymakers and the people who are affected by this policy. On the other hand, we felt it was really important that people who live through the effects of this policy are also able to share their experiences. So theater was a really helpful way of doing this, or participatory theater, I should say. First of all,
what does that mean, Umut, participatory theatre? We'll see it on the video, but it would be good to hear a little bit more about what the thinking behind it is, how it works.
Absolutely. So the way that we have been working with these methods is we've been using let's say two main schools of participatory theater. One is called playback theater, and that's how we usually start out to warm up the people that we're working with. And that is where our participants can share a story, something that happened to them, and actors will play it back on the spot to them. And the person who told the story can then also say how they felt about it, what was right, what was perhaps not quite right about it. And one of the things that works really well about this playback theater is that it allows people to share an experience. It could be a very mundane experience. So in other groups, we had people talking about when they chose what shoes to wear in the morning, for example, right? It doesn't have to be a problem. And I think that's really important, because migrants are often seen as if all they have is either they only have problems or they are a problem.
Yeah.
So that's really important for us, that we allow people to talk about anything they wish. And it could be something very simple, fun, like, what shoes to wear. But it also allows others within the group, if they do recognize maybe the experience itself, maybe parts of that experience, then it allows us to start a conversation. And what they might do is they might say, okay, that's what happened to you. I had a similar experience, but I felt really differently about it, right? So we can develop a conversation that sparks off, let's say, from their stories, but also allows for differences in views, differences in experience, differences in opinion. But for this group in particular, I think it was really important because one of the problems that one of the effects of this no recourse to public funds policy is that it's a very shaming policy. People often feel as if it is their own fault. And this is, of course, something that's very pervasive in our society. That's, people are blamed for being so-called dependent. And of course, being subject to migration control itself is also a very stigmatizing. It is nowadays very stigmatizing. It's as so we had a discussion within the group, for example, where they challenged our naming of the project, that we talked about migrant families, and this group said, we're not migrants. We've been living here for a long time. They said we have colonial ties with this country, so we should have the same rights as the Queen. Right, and I think that's a really important point to acknowledge. But alongside the fact that what they are saying here is they're claiming their rights and their rightful place in this society, which is really important. But on the other hand, it also shocked me to see that the word migrant was almost used as a swear word, right? So I think that's really problematic in itself. So to come back to your question, which was really, what do those theater methods do? In this case, there was a lot of shame in the room, a lot of sadness and difficulty. And by sharing these stories with each other through theater, through that, so there's this triangle, so to speak, of the teller, the actors, but also there's a facilitator and the group. But by making those experiences visible, it's also something that was able to create a feeling of group feeling, right? And allowed people to share experiences with each other, despite the shame and social isolation that they had experienced before. And another aspect of the participatory theater that we use, I should very briefly mention, is called forum theater, following Augusto Boal's work that some may be familiar with, of the theater of the oppressed, which began to be developed in South America. So the idea there is that someone again shares a story, something that happened to them, a problem, a conflict, a dilemma, and then invites others within the group to step into the scene, into the theater scene, and see how they may make a difference. Yeah. So it's about, so the way that Augusto Boal said it, and I think that works very well for our work as well, is that you're inviting people to rehearse for social change in real life. So they are rehearsing social change in the theater context, and that gives you a lot more freedom. You can do crazy things in the theater, of course, right? You can throw yourself on the floor and start laughing, for example. Crazy things that you might not be able to do in real life, but yeah, it also helps people to actually rehearse strategies for resistance and social change that they may use, and our participants have said that they found that some of these really useful for real life situations as well.
That's great, Umut. Thank you for that description. That gives us a very clear idea of thinking behind the methods, and we'll be able to see the film in a moment after your introduction to it. I found the film fascinating, and particularly the way in which you worked with these women, and then you took the performance to the House of Commons, all parliamentary party group. What happened there, and what effect did that performance have? Did it work? Did the policymakers actually sit up and listen? Did anything change, or is it more a subtle shift in in perception?
That's a really interesting question. So, well, for us, it was really important to have this conversation with our participants quite early on, to say that, look, what we're wanting to do is to have an opportunity for you to have a conversation with policymakers. We don't expect, actually, that one conversation or even an extended conversation will change this policy, because this is very deeply entrenched at the moment. And let's say the political climate is very restrictive towards migrants and migration. It doesn't mean that you can't try, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't put your point across. And I think that was really important for us as researchers to have that conversation. And we feel that what we did say to them and what we attempted to do is that it's important to have this conversation at lots of different levels. So we had this conversation in the House of Commons, but that was, let's say, one of many different engagements they had with lots of different publics. They were also talking with other community groups, migrant community groups. They were also talking with practitioners such as social workers, for example, teachers that they encountered, other migrant support and advocacy organizations, or children's support and advocacy organizations. So a whole range of different engagements, because we were a bit worried about raising this expectation that we're going to show how people who are affected by this policy experience it, and then there will be a change, because that would be not realistic, really.
Yeah.
So we did that. This was an ongoing process, I should say, to have that conversation. It really was an ongoing process over the months that we were working together. However, so what happened is we had this policy day where we had engagements with these wide-ranging groups, including we had Baroness Ruth Lister, who's a member of the House of Lords there, and that, I think, was, so partly it's a feeling of validation, I think, that they're being heard, that they're being taken seriously, and that people who are in powerful positions take them seriously. I think that was really important. And on that particular policy day, the feedback was exactly that it was important to also see and feel the effects of this policy. And as a consequence of that, we were invited then to the all-party parliamentary group on migration. Unfortunately, there weren't many. It was a very small group of policy, MPs who attended the event. However, I should say that I think, there were, lots of questions. So, and I think the other point is also, it's not only about informing those politicians, it's also about informing participants themselves, if you will, and giving them the confidence to be in a space where they are not usually expected to have a presence. So I don't know if yourself or others that are listening have been to the House of Commons. It's a very grand building. It can be quite intimidating, but also there was a lot of excitement for all of us to be in there, actually. But it is not a space that usually welcomes that feels at least welcoming to community groups, certainly not to Black women. So being in that space itself, I think, was something that a lot of our participants really valued. To be able to claim that space, that thing about being able to claim that public space in the center of power, even if they didn't make a change for that one performance, I think was something that was very, that they really enjoyed.
And I think it comes across very well in the film Black Women Act. Umut, how have you carried on using these methods and developing projects through the period of the pandemic and COVID?
Yeah, so that's a really so we were planning on a follow-on project, and we were about to start it when lockdown started in 2020. So that follow-on project was meant to, well, the plan, we're working with a range of migrant support and advocacy organizations, um, because what we wanted to do is to allow them to learn some basics, at least, about these methods, to be able to use them in their ongoing group work. So we were planning a training session, well, not a training session, an extended training, let's say, and some sessions where they could practice it. Lockdown happened, and at first we were all in shock and didn't know what to do. The lockdown and COVID in general, I think, has had a very severe effect on migrants everywhere, including this group of migrants with no recourse to public funds. All the problems that they were faced with have basically been exacerbated. So, be it social isolation, be it poverty, be it homelessness, all of it has been exacerbated. So, for example, you might find a family was in just one small room with their children, and then during lockdown, when you're not allowed to go out, when you haven't got the access even to things like school meals, although that's, well, anyway, when you haven't got access to digital communication because it's too expensive, people don't have internet in their homes, etc., etc., that can, of course, be much more draining, much more challenging than it was for everybody, let's say. Yeah. So these situations of deep poverty and deep destitution have been worsened, including the social isolation that goes hand in hand with that. What we have been doing with this, so that's why in the early days, I think we were all a bit stunned and felt that the first thing that's also our partner organizations were doing was to focus on these very basic survival needs again, once again. Yeah, and there are so many really difficult stories that's yeah, okay, so with this project, then we decided to go online in the autumn of 2020, and what we did is we started this training and the exercises, etc., online, and something really amazing happened. We were a bit skeptical with our theater practitioners that in this project, again, Irini Kaptani and her colleague Francis Rifkin. So we were not very well versed, let's say, with using these methods online, and thought, oh, it's really important. These methods are embodied methods. How you move in space, how you connect to a person is really important. But we found that actually these workshops soon became the highlight of all our weeks, I should say, not just our participants, but also myself, or ourselves as the research team, and even our theater practitioners. I think they soon became the highlight of that, because something really interesting happened, that people found it. So these are methods that oftentimes are quite fun, because what you learn is to use your body, use your voice in ways that you don't usually do, and that can be something that's also fun. So we all had a lot of fun there. That, I think, was important, but also some really interesting and exciting feedback that we received from our participants in those online groups was that, we said part of these exercises is to be able to break the frame. You see, so you're going to have to break the rules of what you're expected to do and what you're supposedly allowed to do. So breaking the frame, if you look here at the screen, it is of course framed in itself, right? So there's visual ways of breaking the frame by just moving out of it, into it, etc. But also, of course, that's all got to do with with social relations, with relations of power, that we can break the rules and challenge those relations in a number of ways. And for example, humor is one of those ways, of course, yeah, to make people laugh, to not take power seriously sometimes, or to show the funny and ridiculous sides of those. So something that happened there is that people said, you know, I've realized that we are much more, that I'm much more able to challenge the rules than I thought. Yeah, so for example, something like that. And then
so one of your key arguments is that these methods can sort of provide a pathway to women claiming rights, to articulating experiences, to communicating them, so that they're actually part and parcel of citizenship practices. Would you like to sort of end by summarising some of your core academic arguments across many of your really brilliant papers that we've all read and felt quite inspired by?
Thank you, Mari. You're very kind and generous. So I think something that I've always been interested in doing, I already mentioned that migration and migrants are often seen either as a problem or as causing, you know, either they have a problem or they are a problem. And for me, that's always been something that I wanted to look beyond and to challenge. And what I thought, and you know, I'm really motivated by the idea to see what does the world look like if we don't take migration as an exception, if we don't take the views and experiences of migrants as an exception, but what happens if we put them center stage and see the world through their experiences? And citizenship is one such example. So oftentimes migrants in general, migrant families, migrant mothers in particular are seen as, they could be, oftentimes they are seen as obstacles to their children's citizenship. So they are seen as, you know, being maybe too culturally different, maybe not speaking enough English at home, and all of those things are things where we have heard from politicians over the years, and unfortunately they are being repeated again and again. And in that way, they are seen as standing in the way of their children's integration, or they could be seen as a threat to the cultural or social cohesion of this society. So in that sense, they're seen either at the boundaries or outside of citizenship, right? So what I've tried to do is to really turn this on its head and say, what happens if we see the things that migrant mothers do already as parts of citizenship? Because what they do is they are building a community by bringing up their children in an ethnically diverse society. And what happens if we take seriously what they're already doing as contributions to citizenship? How do we need to think differently as academics, as policymakers, and as a general public about what citizenship should mean, actually? So
I think that's brilliant, Umut. And I think a lot of your empirical work and theoretical work elaborates that idea, but it's a great moment to end on and to get us all thinking about how do we think about citizenship, and how a more expanded notion of citizenship that takes into account the everyday practices of migrant mothers that you, for example, that you document, can be seen as part of that process. I think that's a great note to end on. Umut, thanks ever so much for your time and for this inspiring conversation. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.